Tonight we begin with a military strike of such strategic magnitude that senior Pentagon officials had described it as inevitable, defense analysts had warned about it for weeks, and global energy markets had already begun pricing in the shock before the bombs even fell. I am John, and I have spent the last several hours analyzing multiple incoming reports, open source intelligence, satellite imagery assessments, and defense signals, and what's emerging is not what mainstream coverage is focusing on. I've analyzed multiple international reports, open source intelligence, and defense signals. A strike that didn't unfold over months of negotiation, but in a matter of hours on a single March night. Hours that changed the calculus of an entire war. Hours that put the world's most critical oil choke point directly in the crosshairs. Hours that forced every major energy trader, every naval commander, and every Gulf government to update their threat assessments simultaneously. What the United States did on March 13, 2026, crossed a line that Iran had spent decades protecting, and that Washington had carefully avoided crossing, until now. And when that line broke, the U.S. Air Force did not hesitate. They responded with overwhelming force, surgical precision, and a very deliberate message. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official confirmations, not formal announcements, just patterns, movements, and intelligence indicators suggesting that something was coming to Karg Island. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, PBS NewsHour, and cross-referenced with open-source satellite data published by Planet Labs and the European Space Agency's Copernicus Sentinel-2 program, Karg Island had already been under intense international scrutiny since at least early March 2026. Satellite imagery captured on March 2nd, 11 days before the strike, showed the full operational status of the island's oil export terminals, active, full, and functioning. Every pipeline still running, every tanker berth still open. Iran has always been strategically protective of Karg Island, but also extremely methodical in how it uses the island as a pressure lever. Since the outbreak of the broader 2026 Iran conflict on February 28th, analysts had noted a deliberate Iranian posture: keep Karg running, block the Strait of Hormuz, and use the island's economic significance as a shield. Their behavior followed a pattern, a rhythm of military operations near the strait while carefully insulating the island from direct retaliation. But in the first 2 weeks of March, something changed. The IRGC began using Karg Island not just as an oil export hub, but as a forward staging position for naval mine operations and missile storage directed at the Strait of Hormuz. And experts who monitor Persian Gulf military logistics know exactly what that means when the two roles begin to merge. The island was being militarized beyond its traditional economic function. Military hardware, including submarine-launched naval mines and surface-to-sea missile systems, was being stockpiled in facilities adjacent to the oil infrastructure. IRGC naval units were rotating through the island in greater numbers than peacetime patterns would suggest. And then, the normal civilian logistics traffic around the island went unusually quiet. And when things go silent on Karg, that's when something loud is about to happen. Early on March 13, 2026, official confirmation came directly from U.S. President Donald Trump himself, who announced that the U.S. military had conducted large-scale bombing operations on Karg Island, specifically targeting what the Pentagon described as Iranian military infrastructure embedded within the island's strategic zone. According to the Wikipedia entry on the 2026 Karg Island attack, cross-referenced with reporting from Al Jazeera and PBS, the U.S. Air Force executed strikes against more than 90 Iranian military sites on the island. And according to Britannica's contemporaneous coverage, those sites included storage facilities for submarine naval mines, the very weapons Iran had been deploying to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, and missile systems that were actively threatening Gulf shipping lanes. Critically, the oil and gas infrastructure was deliberately spared. This is the detail that most mainstream coverage missed, and it matters enormously. These are the types of highly selective targeting decisions that are only made when signaling three things simultaneously. First, that the United States has the intelligence capability to surgically distinguish military from civilian infrastructure. Second, that Washington is offering Iran a choice, not an ultimatum. And third, that the next strike could look very different. Different sources are interpreting this differently. According to Al Jazeera's March 14th reporting, Trump explicitly warned that Karg's critical oil facilities could be next if Iran continues to block the Strait of Hormuz, a direct and public escalation threat tied to very specific Iranian behavior. Meanwhile, PBS NewsHour cited energy researchers who noted that a strike on the oil terminal itself would not only damage the current Iranian government's revenue stream, but could structurally undermine whatever government eventually replaces it, making it a decision with generational consequences. And according to early assessments from Axios, published March 20th, the Trump administration was already considering something even more dramatic: blockading or physically occupying Karg Island as leverage to force the strait back open. But one thing is absolutely clear: the United States has shifted Karg Island from off-limits to on the table. The Iranian response was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was immediate, and it carried a temperature that analysts described as genuinely dangerous. Within hours of the March 13th strike, Iranian officials issued statements warning that any follow-up attack on oil structures on the island would reduce U.S.-linked oil facilities to a pile of ashes. These were not diplomatic talking points. These were high-temperature strategic warnings, the kind that carry operational meaning in a conflict already producing hundreds of drone and missile strikes per week across 6 Gulf nations simultaneously. According to the Congressional Research Service's March 2026 analysis of the Strait of Hormuz crisis, Iran had at this stage already declared the strait closed beginning March 4th, carried out multiple attacks on commercial shipping vessels, and laid naval mines in the waterway, all while maintaining Karg's oil flow as a deliberate economic lifeline that gave the regime a degree of leverage with China, its primary oil customer. The strike on Karg's military positions threatened to collapse that entire strategic architecture in a single night, and Iran knew it, which is why the response wasn't just verbal. According to initial assessments, IRGC forces on and near the island were placed on elevated alert, and Iran's naval posture in the northern Persian Gulf shifted in the hours following the strikes. Tonight, multiple reports confirm that U.S. forces carried out precision strikes targeting the following categories of infrastructure on Karg Island: IRGC naval mine storage facilities, the sites directly responsible for supplying the sea mines that Iran had deployed in the Strait of Hormuz, which the U.S. military had already identified and begun clearing, with Trump publicly stating that U.S. forces had destroyed 16 Iranian mine layers. Surface-to-sea missile systems, the weapons being used to threaten and attack commercial vessels transiting the Gulf region, part of what the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre had documented as over a dozen attacks on ships since hostilities began. IRGC command and logistics infrastructure, the coordination layer that connected Karg's forward military positioning to wider operations in the Persian Gulf theater, including the island's military command nodes, which had recently been upgraded from their standard peacetime status for active operational purposes, a status change that U.S. intelligence reportedly tracked in real time. This was not random. This was strategic targeting of operational military infrastructure that happened to be co-located with one of the most economically sensitive pieces of real estate on the planet. They didn't act recklessly. They deliberately excluded the Falat Iran Oil Company's 500,000 barrel per day crude production facilities. They didn't overextend. They hit a defined set of military targets in a coordinated raid. They hit exactly what mattered and left exactly what they wanted to threaten next. And this is where the situation becomes significantly more serious. Analysts now believe that Iran's decision to militarize Karg Island, using it as a forward base for mine and missile operations while simultaneously shielding it behind its economic significance, was itself a calculated test of U.S. resolve. Iran was betting that Washington would not cross the threshold of striking Karg because the economic and diplomatic consequences of hitting the island, even its military infrastructure, were considered potentially catastrophic. Tehran was betting on American hesitation. They were wrong. The United States responded with precision, speed, and a carefully constructed message that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. We can find your military hardware, even when you hide it next to your oil tanks. We chose not to hit your oil today. That choice is entirely reversible. This wasn't just a reaction to Iranian mine warfare in the Strait. It was a warning shot, calibrated to communicate future intent, and the fact that Trump immediately followed the strike with a public statement tying Karg's oil infrastructure to continued Iranian strait-blocking behavior confirms that the message was entirely deliberate. According to energy researcher Petros Katinas at the Royal United Services Institute, cited by PBS, Karg Island is not just economically significant, it is critical to funding Iran's government and military. Destroy that revenue stream, and you don't just hurt the current regime, you reshape the entire post-war landscape of Iran. As more information comes in, the scale of what happened on March 13th and what it fits within becomes clearer. The U.S. Air Force executed strikes on more than 90 Iranian military sites on a single island in a single operation. the largest single-target raid on Iranian soil since the conflict began on February 28th. Iran had, in the preceding 2 weeks, launched hundreds of missiles and drones against the UAE alone, with the UAE Ministry of Defense confirming it had intercepted 537 ballistic missiles, 2,256 drone attacks, and 26 cruise missiles by early April. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman had all been subjected to Iranian strikes as well, with Qatar's Qatar Energy declaring force majeure on LNG contracts and halting all gas production, a shock that sent European natural gas prices nearly doubling overnight. Iran had struck Dubai International Airport, the Jebel Ali port, a French naval airbase in Abu Dhabi, an Amazon Web Services data center, and the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait City. This was not a small incident evolving in isolation. The Karg Island strike was the single most consequential act of escalation targeting Iranian sovereign territory in that entire sequence, because it was the first time U.S. forces directly struck the island that funds the regime that started the conflict. This situation goes far beyond the battlefield of any single island in the Persian Gulf. It directly and immediately impacts 3 interconnected global systems. Global trade routes. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 25% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of global LNG passes, remain largely blocked as of early April. The Karg Island strike introduced a new variable into whether that blockade continues or escalates. Energy supply chains. The head of the International Energy Agency described the situation triggered by the 2026 Iran conflict as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. LNG spot prices in Asia had already surged over 140% following the strike on Qatar's Ras Laffan complex in March. European gas storage was at historically low levels, just 30% capacity, following a harsh winter. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks had nearly doubled to over 60 euros per megawatt hour by mid-March. Regional and global financial stability. Oil prices, shipping insurance premiums, aluminum costs, up 8% due to the war, and fertilizer supply chains were all in active disruption. The 2026 fuel crisis was being compared by economists to the 1970s energy crisis in terms of scale and cascading consequences. According to economic analysts cited across multiple outlets, events like the Karg Island strike can influence not just oil prices, but bond yields, mortgage rates, food prices, and currency valuations simultaneously. The U.S. 10-year bond yield jumped to 4.46%, its highest since July 2025, in the weeks following the initial conflict outbreak. This is not isolated. This is interconnected, and the Karg strike just pulled on a thread that runs through every one of those systems. At this stage, it's important to note precisely how this analysis was assembled, because in a conflict moving this fast, source discipline matters. Al Jazeera's March 14th reporting highlights Iran's public warning that oil facilities would be the next target, and provides the most granular account of Iranian diplomatic framing around the strike. PBS NewsHour's coverage focuses on the long-term strategic implications of striking Karg, including the generational economic consequences, and the Rusi energy researchers' assessment of Karg's centrality to Iranian state funding. The Wikipedia entry on the 2026 Karg Island attack, cross-referenced with Britannica's contemporaneous article, provides the confirmed target list: 90-plus military sites, mine storage, missile systems, and confirms that oil infrastructure was deliberately excluded. The Congressional Research Service's March 2026 analysis of the Strait of Hormuz crisis provides the legal, naval, and geopolitical framing, including the precise detail that Iran had laid fewer than 10 mines in the strait by early March, and Trump's public ultimatum to remove them or face consequences at a level never seen before. The Atlantic Council's analysis from March 2nd adds the broader GCC perspective, capturing how Gulf states moved from shock to strategic reassessment in the first 48 hours of the conflict. This analysis you're watching is based on combining all of that verified, cross-referenced information, separated clearly from speculation, which we'll get to now. Analysts are now actively considering multiple scenarios emerging from the Karg Island strike and what comes next. One possibility is that the United States follows through on its implied threat, and that a second, expanded strike on Karg's oil infrastructure becomes the final economic lever used to force Iran to reopen the strait. According to Axios, Trump was already considering blockading or physically occupying the island as of March 20th. That is not a small escalation, That is a move that would effectively place America's military between Iran and its primary revenue source. Another possibility is that the March 13th strike accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish, that Iran received the message, recalculated its risk exposure, and that the mutual signaling around Karg is precisely what set the conditions for the conditional ceasefire announced on April 8th. In this reading, the strike on military sites was a de-escalatory action dressed in escalatory clothing. And the most concerning scenario, the one that keeps analysts awake, is that Iran's parallel acceleration of drone and missile production capacity, combined with the IRGC's demonstrated willingness to strike civilian infrastructure across 6 Gulf countries simultaneously, means the next phase of this conflict could look entirely different from what we've seen so far. Initial assessments suggest that if Iran perceives an imminent strike on Karg's oil terminal, it may preemptively attempt to destroy the facility itself, denying the revenue to any successor government while maximizing global energy market shock as a strategic weapon. At this point, the ceasefire is holding, but none of these scenarios have been confirmed as off the table. The indicators are worth watching with extreme attention. From my analysis, there are now 2 clear paths forward for both sides in this conflict, and neither is comfortable. Either the United States escalates further and moves against Karg's oil infrastructure, risking a global energy shock that even Washington's own economists would describe as uncontrollable, while potentially destroying the economic foundation of whatever post-regime Iran eventually emerges. Or the United States holds at the March 13th threshold, maintaining the military-only strike as the ceiling, using it as leverage in the ongoing ceasefire negotiations now being mediated by Pakistan, and accepts that Iran retains a functioning economic asset that funds continued IRGC operations. Both options come with consequences that extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. If Karg burns, the world's energy markets feel it within hours, not days. If Karg is preserved as a negotiating chip, Iran retains a revenue stream that could fund a rebuilt military posture within years, not decades. Neither is simple. And neither can be decided without understanding what Karg Island actually represents, which is why tonight's coverage matters. This is John, reporting for Orbit Signal News. All analysis in this report is based on publicly available data, open source intelligence, satellite imagery assessments, reporting from Al Jazeera, PBS NewsHour, the Atlantic Council, the Congressional Research Service, Britannica, Axios, and Wikipedia's documented conflict timelines, all cross-referenced for accuracy. Situations like these change rapidly, and emerging information may alter the assessments presented here. According to early reports and initial assessments, the Karg Island strike represents the most strategically significant single military action of the 2026 Iran conflict so far. Not because of what was destroyed, but because of what was deliberately left standing, and what that decision signals about what comes next. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we track these developments in real time as they happen. And I want to hear your analysis. What do you think happens next? Does Washington move on Karg's oil, or does the ceasefire hold? Drop your assessment in the comments. Because in situations like this, every perspective matters.